A Situation Room meeting this afternoon at the White House involving the president and his top national security advisors has ended. We don't know what that means. We just know that it occurred, and that it occurred in the context of very deep and possibly largely, hugely important deliberations President Trump and that aforementioned national security team are having about what to do or not to do in Iran. I want to get some perspective on that from Virginia Democratic Senator Tim Kaine, who joins us now via Zoom from Capitol Hill. Senator, your thoughts on what you've heard from the president, the reporting out of London that Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, has told his cabinet to be on alert for a potential U.S. strike in Iran. Do you feel like things are moving, and possibly irreversibly so?
Major, not irreversibly. I'm going to begin and put my cards on the table. It would be foolishness of the highest order for the U.S. to be involved in a war with Iran. We should not. When I got elected to the Senate in 2012, having lived through in Virginia, a very military state, the effects of Iraq and Afghanistan on thousands of military families, I pledged in the Senate I would do anything I could to stop an unnecessary war. And this would be an unnecessary war. I think it would be catastrophic for the U.S. to be involved. I support Israel's defense. I support the U.S. helping Israel defend itself. But as we're getting urged to join in bombing campaigns that would lead to retaliation against U.S. troops, U.S. citizens, U.S. diplomatic personnel, I just have to do all I can to stop it. I think the president is still really grappling with this. Everything he has said from long before he was president is that the U.S. shouldn't be at wars in the Middle East, that we're bad at nation building, that we're not appreciated when we do it, and that we need to focus on the primary adversary the U.S. has these days, which is China, and that the Middle East just bogs us down. I hope he just listens to what he said for years and not to advisors who are trying to push him into a mistaken military engagement where the U.S. would join in a war against Iran that would have, I think, very negative consequences.
You have long advocated for war powers within the United States Congress. You going to do so again?
Yes. On Monday, Major, I filed a privilege resolution. A privilege resolution means even one senator can file it, and you will be guaranteed a vote in a short period of time. They can't kill it in committee. They can't otherwise do you mischief. It's kind of magic because it's so important that the matter ought to be taken up by the entire Senate. I filed on Monday a simple privilege resolution under the War Powers Act, basically saying the U.S. should not be at war with Iran unless Congress explicitly votes to be in such a war. Now, importantly, this resolution would not stop the president from being able to defend the U.S. against an Iranian attack. It just says no offensive war. That will likely come up for a vote late next week. All of my colleagues will have to declare whether they think war with Iran is a good idea or a bad idea. I might lose that vote, but I think everyone in the Senate should agree that this is a matter of such gravity and importance that we shouldn't allow a war to begin without Congress having a debate in full view of the American public and members of the Senate and House having to go on the record about it.
Senator Kaine, you said you support Israel's right to defend itself. Do you support its assault on Iran now to degrade Iran's nuclear program?
Well, here's my thought about that, Major. First, I'm very, very disappointed that Israel and President Trump abandoned diplomacy, because we had a diplomatic deal that was working to curb Iranian nuclear program. And don't take Tim Kaine's word for it. Our allies all said that it was working. The International Atomic Energy Agency said that it was working. Many in the Israeli intel and military side said that it was working. President Trump's own Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, all said, stay in the deal. It's not making Iran from a bad guy into a good guy, and Iran is still doing other things that we have to worry about. But the nuclear program is under control with an inspections regime that will enable us to know if they decide to break the deal. Instead, Donald Trump tore it up. And so now, what are we trying to get? the assassination of scientists, civilians in Tehran dying, civilians in Israel dying, all to put a lid on a program that was effectively controlled by diplomacy. So I'm going to start there. I think this military effort to kneecap Iran's nuclear program is a sad and tragic consequence of the U.S., with Israeli urging, abandoning diplomacy. The second thing I will note is when Israel launched the bombing campaign against Tehran last Friday, President Trump was pursuing diplomacy, and they had a diplomatic meeting with Iran scheduled on Sunday. Israel couldn't have waited 3 days? I mean, it just seems trying to block a diplomatic deal, trying to tear up a diplomatic deal once it's in place, and then launching a military strike 3 days before a diplomatic meeting suggests to me that we haven't exhausted the diplomatic option, and that some prefer war rather than diplomacy. I prefer diplomacy rather than war, especially when in this instance it was working.
Senator Kaine, you have probably read, as I have, assessments that diplomacy might have been a ruse to lull the Iranians into a false sense of security, giving the Israelis more opportunities than they otherwise might have to inflict the damage, personnel and otherwise, that they did.
I have heard that reporting, although, you know, I don't think it was a ruse, but I can see why Iran might believe that it was. Again, President Trump, since before he was president, has talked about wanting to not have the U.S. involved in forever wars in the Middle East. So I think while the president made a grievous and consequential error in tearing up the diplomatic deal, I think he did reach the conclusion that diplomacy in this instance was preferable to war to curtail Iran's nuclear program. And so I supported the president in restarting the diplomatic dialogue, and I don't think it was being done as a ruse to give Israel cover to prepare for full-on bombing and war. But I can understand why some might look at it and view it differently.
Right. Before I let you go, Senator Kaine, you mentioned the Iraq War. The Senate, the Congress of the United States, a fair number of Americans are traumatized by what was said about the underlying intelligence that preceded that war and what proved ultimately to be true and in direct conflict with that underlying intelligence. What do you believe is the knowable intelligence about Iran's proximity, not only to a nuclear weapon, but the means by which to deliver it to Israel or anywhere else?
Much of what I know as a Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committee member, I know from classified information that I can't share, but I'm going to tell you what has widely been publicly reported and what President Trump's national security advisor has said recently. And this has been pretty consistent reporting, Major, for years now. First, the Iranian program was under control. When Donald Trump tore up the deal, we all predicted Iran would then begin to build more centrifuges and enrich more uranium, which they have done. But everything that has been publicly reported, including what the National Security Advisor has said, is that even though Iran has done that, there had been no decision by the Iranian government to convert enriched uranium into a nuclear weapon, much less a nuclear weapon that could be delivered in a missile or an other component. The decision had not been made to create such a weapon. And that has been pretty consistent in public reporting and in what you have heard U.S. intelligence officials say for a number of years.
Virginia Democratic Senator Tim Kaine. Senator Kaine, I appreciate the time very much, sir. Thank you.
Glad to be with you, Major.